Hi, this is Cameron with the Burnside team at Keller Williams Real Estate. On today's video, as part of our ongoing endeavor to help you be educated and know what you need to do as far as real estate goes, I wanted to go ahead and share with you what a common question is that I have with sellers as I'm working with them to help sell their house. That is, when it comes to disclosing things for the next buyer, what am I required to do and what am I not required to do? So as is a lot of the topics that we go over, this can go a lot of different directions and there's a lot of nuances to it, but I wanted to talk about just three real main points that as a seller you would want to disclose to the next buyer. So the first one has to do with any HOA association with the property. Now, most commonly this will have to do if you're living in a townhouse, a condo, perhaps in a planned unit development. You need to make sure the next buyer is aware of all the documentation that goes along with any of the CC&Rs, the rules and the regulations, if there's an HOA fee, anything that a buyer would want to know, because last thing anybody wants to have happen is to move into a community, find out that, oh, wow, I can't actually park in front of my house, or there's no street parking, or just some of those things are really, really frustrating for buyers, and potentially there's some legal implications if you don't disclose that. So if there's an HOA, make sure that you disclose everything about that. Provide the documentation, contact information for the HOA, property management, so that way the buyer can ask any questions, but make sure you're getting all the documentation to them. The second thing has to do with any major structural things. Now, there is a form that we have our sellers fill out, and it's 16 pages long, so it gets into very, very minute detail as to different things with it. So this is an overarching, all-encompassing kind of a statement, but if you've done work on the property, it's good to disclose that. It has to do with structural things. So that means if you've moved walls, if you have added an addition to the house, if you have taken something out of the, you've completely switched out the sewer line, any of those big projects or things that are really, really important that you make sure that the buyer is aware of in writing, so that that buyer can check out, make sure that everything is okay with the inspector or buyer's relatives, anybody who wants to look into it. And then they sign this document stating that, hey, I understand that you disclosed this to me, and I'm not going to come back and tell you that I'm mad because you didn't let me know about the enormous addition that you did 15 years ago. And if I would have known that now, I would have maybe asked some different questions. So those are some bigger things as far as the structural piece goes. You don't have to disclose if you've repainted or recarpeted, more of the cosmetic things. But if you started to get into some of the bigger ticket items, I would disclose that. So where do you draw that line? I always recommend to my clients that if you ever have a question, should I or shouldn't I, always better to just go ahead and disclose it. And that way, if there's ever any kind of a question, it doesn't come up after the fact and after the close has taken place. And the third thing that we'll talk about is what's called any federal documentation that's required. The most prevalent in this situation has to do with something called lead-based paint. So if your property was built before 1978, there's a chance that it does have lead-based paint in it. There's a document that you can get, and it's called a lead-based paint addendum. That basically, or disclosure, excuse me. That's basically just stating that if you have any documentation, so if you've ever tested for lead-based paint, or if, for example, you're aware that there's lead-based paint used, which is not very common, then you disclose that, and that is a federal law to make sure that the next buyer is aware of it. It doesn't mean you have to go out and test it. It doesn't mean you have to do certain things, but if you have knowledge of it right then and there, when you're signing those disclosures, you do have to communicate that to the buyer. That's a really, really important one. That is a federal law. So those are just some of the main things that we talk about. And when I sit down with sellers, we go through this document quite in depth. And there's a lot of questions that will come up, and there's a lot of nuances to it. But those are three that will be very, very important that you're disclosing to make sure that you don't have issues after the fact. I've seen some really nasty lawsuits and some really, really bad legal battles just because there wasn't proper disclosure. So make sure you're disclosing. And as always, if you are thinking about selling your house, or if you're thinking, what do I disclose and what do I not disclose? Give me a call. I'm happy to walk you through that. We'll look forward to talking with you soon. Have the rest of an amazing day.